Ecclesiastes chapter 8. We are breaking into a new chapter here and looking forward to what God has for us in our text. Our passage is going to be the first 9 verses of this chapter this morning, verses 1 through 9. And as I read these verses in just a moment, I'd encourage you to think through and reflect on how this connects with what we saw back in chapter 7. Chapter 7, we saw a lot about wisdom, and we're not quite done with that topic yet. And so we'll get there, but as I read this morning, these first 9 verses, maybe think about that and begin to make some connections, and then we'll break into the text in just a moment. Let's read these verses beginning in verse 1. Who is like the wise? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command, because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Quite a text this morning, a number of things in here that we're going to have to do our best to piece together and what exactly is happening here. But our passage begins this morning with literally 2 questions and then kind of a follow-up to those questions. And I want to first start off by connecting this back and giving a connection back to chapter 7, as I mentioned before we read the passage. Throughout chapter 7, we saw Solomon repeatedly hold up wisdom as a valuable thing. He dealt with the twisted realities of life. Remember that message? And laid out these things that this is twisted about life. What do I do with this? And his conclusion was, we need God's wisdom. We need skill to live God's way in God's world. That's how we defined wisdom. We saw that in Scripture a little bit. And he said this, that wisdom is as valuable as an inheritance. If you can believe that, think about how valuable an inheritance would be in your pocket, in your bank account today. That's how valuable wisdom is. And he even presses this, we've touched on this a few times. He says, look, wisdom is able to not just protect your life, but even preserve your life. That's pretty valuable. However, chapter 7 ended with an interesting and maybe even discouraging discovery. The last time we were in this book, we looked at the last few verses of chapter 7, and in essence, what Solomon does there, he says, look, I took wisdom, this really, really valuable thing. It doesn't untangle all the twisted things of life, and it doesn't guarantee success, and dealt with that, but I took wisdom, and I applied it to life in general, and I discovered something. It didn't answer everything, but I discovered something, and I want to share that lesson with you. And that lesson we summarize this way. The lesson was, he discovered the absolute depravity of humanity. Yay! That's very valuable. I'm really glad for wisdom. You want wisdom, right? So you can see that better? You say, I already figured that out. It sounds like a really discouraging lesson. Well, Solomon's point is, I took wisdom, I looked at life, and I came away realizing, I'll use what we talked about last time, I found a depravity among humanity that's bitter, that's thorough, and rebellious. And we worked through that last time in chapter 7. All of that valuable wisdom, and that's the lesson, Solomon? It can't solve all the riddles. It doesn't guarantee success. Well, maybe then here's my conclusion. And we've done this. This is what Solomon seems to be doing. He's kind of dealing with the human tendency. So I'll just get wisdom and I'll have success in life. And he goes, not quite. Can't go there. Doesn't do that. But it's still valuable. And here again, he says, now I learned a lesson from wisdom. And in our human tendency, we go, I don't need that. I don't need to be taught that. So why would I need wisdom? And I would argue that chapter 8, verses 1 through 9, is something of a counteract to that kind of tendency, to look at that lesson from wisdom and go, I don't need that, Solomon. I don't need wisdom to tell me that. If that's the value that wisdom has, I can find something else. I don't need any more despairing news in my life how bad humanity is. Well, in response to that, this morning's passage, verses 1 through 9, would urge us not to rush to that conclusion just yet. Don't toss away wisdom too quickly. Our text presents a message this morning I've titled, The Unquestionable Attractiveness of Wisdom. The unquestionable attractiveness of wisdom. Our text, as I mentioned, starts with a positive statement about wisdom in verse 1 and then explains that statement in verses 2 through 9. So our outline this morning, I'm going to use two words. Our outline this morning is more or less this. We're going to look at the lesson, and then we're going to go to the lab. Verse 1 gives us the lesson. And then more or less, what Solomon's going to do is he's going to take that lesson, he's going to take it into a lab in life, and that lab specifically is the realm of authority. And so we're going to look at that this morning in that way. We're going to look at the passage in that way. And so let's just start by learning about the lesson here in verse 1. There's two questions in verse 1. And we're going to work to the lesson. So just stick with me. We're going to work through this, kind of work our way until we get to the lesson at the end. So just follow along here. He asks two questions. Who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of things? Well, those are best understood as what we could say are rhetorical questions. In other words, they both have an understood answer. So the first question asks us to compare people with a wise individual. Who is like this person, a wise person? Who is like that? And the answer, no one. No one is like that. There's no one who rises to the level of this. This question comes from the man whose own wisdom surpassed any in his day. Foreign visitors to Israel, like the Queen of Sheba, confirmed this. I heard about you, Solomon, but now I've come and I've looked at your expanse and I've looked at your kingdom, I've looked how you rule, and I've looked at your wisdom, and wow, everything has been true. In fact, it's beyond what I even heard. Who's like that person? And the rhetorical answer would be, well, there's no one. There's really no comparison to a wise person, and Solomon knows this firsthand. So the second question asks us to discover someone who can give the interpretation of things. And this we have to give a little thought to, because what exactly are we talking about, give the interpretation of things? Are we talking about who can stand up and interpret another language, like interpreter, like what the Ogdens had and the team had on their trip to Honduras? Interpreter? What are we talking about here when Solomon asks who knows the interpretation of things? The Hebrew word translated interpretation in the ESV here is the only time this specific word shows up, this Hebrew word shows up. However, we have a connected, related word in Aramaic that shows up in Daniel. And it really helps us here. So the Aramaic form of this word appears in Daniel 2 specifically. And I want to just walk us through the story. You might be familiar with it. If not, I'll give you enough details. Hopefully, pieces come together for us. Really trying to understand what is this interpretation thing. In Daniel 2, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon dreams a dream that he wants his wise men to interpret for him. That's the word. He's looking for the interpretation, all right? Well, his wise men come. These are the Magi, we might call them that. Hear a connection to the Christmas story later on. But the wise men come, and Nebuchadnezzar thinks, you know what, I've got a little challenge for them because I'm not quite confident they're always giving me the right answer. I think they might be making things up sometimes. And so he gives them a test. He says, all right, I've got it, guys. You guys are first going to tell me what I dreamed, then the interpretation. If you can get what I dreamed, I'll trust you with the interpretation. Well, the wise men, they hem and haw, and well, just tell us the dream, king. No. That's not how this works. You're going to tell me the dream. And they finally admit, no one can do that. I mean, there's no way. You wouldn't even attempt to try and tell me what I dreamed last night. Crazy stuff, right? Weird stuff. Who can even guess that? No, we can't do it. And Nebuchadnezzar, he gets frustrated. And so he decides, all right, fine, you're all going to lose your very wise heads. Execute them all. But there's an individual in the land named Daniel, who is a Jew in exile. He is one of the wise men. And the guards come around to do the job the king has ordered. And Daniel goes, whoa, 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 whoa. I like my head. All right, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. I'm adding a little bit to the story. But he likes his head. And he says, wait, hang on. What's going on? And so here's the explanation. He goes, you know what? Take me to the king. I will give him, and he uses the word, I'll give him the interpretation. And so he goes, and Daniel first describes the king's dream in spectacular, accurate detail. It's this giant image the king dreamed about, and it's made up of gold and bronze and silver and iron and clay. And then he tells the king, we, not I, we will tell the king its interpretation. There's no one else with Daniel except for him who owns the interpretations of all things, God himself. So Daniel uses this word, and this word shows up all through the story. I take that, let's go back now to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. What is this that Solomon's asking? In other words, here the action of interpretation involves the explaining of something unclear or unknown. Or we might say it's the drawing out of a meaning from something mysterious like a dream. So let's ask the question again. Who knows the interpretation of things like that? And Solomon challenges us to find someone who can do this kind of thing. The answer, we could say it this way, no one except a wise person. So the first question is, who's like a wise person? Go out and find out who's on par with a wise individual. You go out and you realize that the answer is no one. All right, well, who can actually give interpretation, understanding, meaning to things mysterious, unknown? And the answer, no one except a wise person. And here's where I would give a little footnote based on what we saw in Daniel. The reality is that footnoted there, God alone gives that kind of wisdom. So no one except a wise person, someone given wisdom by God alone. But really the emphasis for this moment in this passage would be this reality that we're looking at a wisdom that is held up by Solomon. So let me summarize verse 1 so far. There is an unquestionable ranking and rarity to wisdom. Best way I can describe what that first is getting at. Unquestionable. You can ask the questions, but you're going to come back with rhetorical answers. You're just going to come back with, well, no one, and, well, no one except someone who's wise. It's unquestionable. Unquestionable ranking and rarity to wisdom. The wise person outranks all others, and it's the rare wise person who provides interpretations of things. So just for a moment, remember, end of chapter 7, boy, that's what wisdom teaches? I don't know that I want that. Whoa, 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 hang on. There's an unquestionable rank and rarity to wisdom. Don't throw it away. All right? But now the second half of this verse adds something to our lesson. And we're working our way to the lesson here. We have a Hebrew proverb of synonymous parallelism. So the idea is this, that there's two phrases in this last part of the verse, and they basically say the same thing but differently. They're synonymous, and they parallel each other. So what's going on here? He says, a man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't exactly like to have a shiny face. I don't know if that's really something that all of us are striving for. But wisdom here apparently makes someone's face shine. What in the world does that mean? Well, this is a Hebrew idiom. It's a turn of phrase where when you put a group of words together, it means something other than what those words on their own are going to mean. So we're familiar with things shining, we're familiar with face, all right? But when you put this together, it's an idiom. It's a turn of phrase that means something here. Solomon's not saying wisdom polishes a person's face. And we get some help here from the book of Numbers. You may just want to jot this passage down next to that verse in Ecclesiastes. But Numbers 6, at the very end of Numbers 6, Moses is giving Aaron a blessing from the Lord. And he says these words in verses 24 and 25. May the Lord bless you and protect you. And maybe you know the next part. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. There's the same idiom. What does it mean? What are we talking about here? Best way I could describe it would be this. An individual's wisdom gives a gracious countenance. Someone who is wise is someone who is visibly gracious toward others. The second phrase in verse 1, again, this phrase refers to the hardness of the wise man's face being changed. And again, we have a little help from the Old Testament here. We have the same idea, hardness of face, that's used in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 28, God is giving his blessings and curses to the people of Israel. Look, you obey me, and there's blessing. You disobey, and there's cursing. And in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, one of those curses involves God promising to send against Israel this, a hard-faced nation. There's that idea. A hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. And we have a really helpful reality with this because we actually see God keep this promise. His people disobey, and what does he do? He sends against them a hard-faced nation, actually many. Assyria, Syria, Babylon. And he says, this is a nation that has no respect for old or young. And you read about the things that the Assyrians and the Babylonians did to the people of Israel. Hard-faced means they're fierce, they're unflinching, and they don't have compassion. So, Ecclesiastes 8, what are we talking about here? Well, we could say Solomon is talking about a wise man's hardness of face being changed. That is, wisdom changes a person's face from one of fierceness and harshness to one of graciousness, one of compassion. We talk about this even today. We might describe someone as having a stony face. Just kind of, they just don't emote anything. They're like gruff, whatever. Right? Solomon says, wisdom has the effect of actually changing a person's countenance, softening hard features. It's really interesting. An individual's wisdom gives a gentle countenance, a gracious and gentle countenance. And I think just hearing that is a positive thing to our ears. Maybe even just contrast it for a moment with the opposite possibility, a glowering, dark, harsh, fierce face. Which face would you prefer? Which face would you find more attractive to look at and to have staring you back in the face? That glowering, dark, harsh, fierce face, or this, a gentle, gracious countenance? There's no question. Which brings me to the lesson from this verse. Wisdom makes an individual unquestionably attractive. Wisdom makes an individual unquestionably attractive. And again, just think about that in light of what Solomon has just finished up. We might be tempted to say, I don't want wisdom. If it's the kind of thing that teaches me more about the depravity of humanity, I don't need that. No. You need this because it has the ability to make a person unquestionably attractive. And we'll get to the end. We're going to ask the question at the very end of what's the big deal? Are we simply looking to be better people to those around us in this life? Is that the whole point of this? We'll get there. But for the moment, let's stay with what we're looking at in the passage. Here's the lesson. Wisdom makes one unquestionably attractive. Now, that's a great lesson. Wonderful to hear that, Solomon. Thank you so much. But I want to see that in real life. So, let's go to the lab. And the lab takes us into an area of life that I already alluded to. It takes us into an area of life that Solomon himself knows well, and that is the realm of authority. And just even saying that, I think we can right away even begin to sense this is a really good place to test this lesson out. Interactions with other people, is wisdom actually able to make one attractive to authority? Well, Solomon is going to answer that. And we see this lab of authority immediately in the words of verse 2. I say, keep the king's command. So Solomon just jumps right in. Going to go right to authority, all right? And then verse 9, he alludes to this context of authority. He's been looking at all this and thinking about this. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that's done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. That's really helpful because, in other words, what Solomon is saying here is this. I took it into the lab, not just of ideal authority, I took it into the lab of broken authority. And I wanted to see, can wisdom actually make a person unquestionably attractive in the midst of a broken authority like we have in this world, where people have power over people to their hurt? I don't live in the ideal, folks, and I don't think you do either. And I'm really thankful that Solomon took this into not the ideal, but he took it into the broken reality that we live in. So he deals in the realm of authority. And I just want to note this, the fact that the kind of authority Solomon speaks of here, a monarchy, all right, it's not the same, obviously, as we live in. That's not a problem or a reason to dismiss these words. The general principle of authority remains in place for us today, as we've sung about and seen this morning and even given testimony to. You and I know this. Every one of us lives under the authority of someone else. Employee to boss, child to parent, student to teacher, wife to husband, husband to Christ, citizen to government, church member to pastor, believer to God and His Word. This is life under the sun. So you sit here and go, oh, he's talking about a monarchy. We don't need to listen to this. No. Get the principle. He takes it into the realm of authority that he knew in his day. And there would be people in our world today who would read this, and this would be actually quite appropriate for their context. So take the principle. The type of authority structure may vary, but the lesson can be tested in each the same way Solomon does in our text here this morning. Can wisdom actually make a person attractive, even in the setting of authority that's broken? Well, Solomon is himself a king, so he speaks with knowledge on the issue of authority, and that's important for this lab test. Solomon's acquainted with this whole realm, so he's got personal authority, we could say personal experience here. He can speak with that. If we want to know if God's lesson for us really works, we can maybe say it this way: we want to hear from the professional. Just like if we receive some advice or a lesson about stewarding finances, let's say, well, we probably want to go and take that to a professional. What do you think about this? And Solomon is a king. But even as I say that, I want to remind us of something else before we go forward, and that is this, folks. Keep in mind the next words we read, I cannot stress this enough, they are God's inspired words. So we cannot simply just settle and go, well, these are the words of a king who's biased, obviously, and he wants his people to obey him, so of course he's going to say this. I mean, duh! No, you can't go there. These are the inspired words of God through the pen of Solomon. Yes, his experience brings a certain authority in the sense of he's the professional here, so let's listen to what the king has to say. How does he actually view this? When someone comes to him and acts wisely, how does he respond as the authority? I really want to hear. Does it make them attractive? But this is the Word of God. And we must not just simply pass this off as, well, that's some nice thoughts from a king. Very good. Thank you. Let's go on. These are the words of God. And so what we hear this morning is not simply good, thoughtful wisdom, nice counsel, take it or leave it. This is the Word of God. We must give attention to it. So having said all that, what does Solomon say here? What happens in this lab? I'm going to give you what I believe are three lessons, three things that come out as this lesson is tested in the lab. First of all, wisdom remembers its place before authority. Wisdom remembers its place before authority. In verses 2 through 4, we see some rapid-fire instruction going on. He jumps right in. I say, keep the king's command, right? And I want to replicate the instruction this way. I'm going to kind of rephrase these commands, give you them in three statements, and do it this way. They are, obey the authority, slow the response, and consider the cause. There's a little question of exactly how to best translate some of these words and whatnot and the phrases. It's not going to really change things tremendously, but I think as best as we can summarize, here's the best way to describe it. Obey the authority, slow the response, consider the cause. And these three instructions, I think, provide extended counsel even in dealing with authority, especially difficult authority that we've already noted from verse 9. This is broken authority, those who have power over another to their hurt. How do I respond to that? What does wisdom say? So very quickly, we have this first statement, keep the king's command. Obey the authority. Let's give some thought to this for a moment. We don't live in a monarchy, but Scripture is still clear that God ordains authorities in our lives. And we don't have to go far in Scripture to find other statements that just echo this kind of thing. Romans 13:1, let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. We have other statements in Scripture addressing other authorities. Children, here's one for you. Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. We have one to the church in Hebrews 13:17. Church, obey your leaders and submit to them, since they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account, so that they can do this with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. Jesus exemplified this in his own life. You can go to the life of Christ and you can look at him and listen to him. He's challenged at one point by the Jews about the lawfulness of paying taxes to Caesar. And if you know the story, you know he asked for a coin. He says, whose image is on the coin? And they go, well, Caesar's. And he says, hands them back the coin. He says, then give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. Subtle implication there. Guess whose image is stamped on you? You're made in God's image. Go give your coins to Caesar. Go give your coins to the ones whose image is stamped there. Okay? That's theirs. You're God's. But Jesus responds to his government at that time. You need to pay your taxes. Even when Jesus was wrongly shuttled, I thought about this week and just thinking about maybe a dynamic of Jesus' trial and passion that I hadn't really thought about before. But you watch Jesus and he's shuttled from trial to trial, from sham trial to sham trial by Pilate, then Herod, then back to Pilate, back and forth. And never once, interestingly, and this is a bit of an argument from silence, but I think it stands up, never once do we see Jesus fighting against that transport. No, you're not going to take me. You can't talk to me. There is a submission, there is an obedience to his earthly authority, even when they are in power to do him wrong to his hurt. Amazing. Now, we can mention this. Wisdom also discerns when times like Acts 5:29 occur, when one must obey God rather than men. Times when man's commands clash with God's. Right? There's a wisdom there as well. But for the moment, here in Ecclesiastes, in general, wisdom directs us to start with obedience to authority. And the reason is given in verse 2. We do this because of an oath. There's a little question about this phrase. If you look at the ESV, it says, because of God's oath to the king. Other translations change that. They word it, for the sake, or because of your oath to God. So, what's going on? Literally, best way I can state it is this way. It's for the sake of the oath of God. Is that God's oath to the king? Is that my oath to the government? I want to bypass that, simply point out this. The reason has something to do with an oath God sees. And God takes oaths very seriously. So whichever way you want to land on that, it's because of God's oath to the king. He put him in power. He ordained them to be there. Okay? Probably have examples of that. Maybe even an example like David responding to Saul. I'm not going to kill him. He's God's man. Maybe that. You can also have other examples of individuals because of your oath to the king. You swore an oath. You say, well, we don't do that in this country. Well, actually, by being a citizen, by embracing your citizenship, you may not have stood in a court and given an oath of citizenship, but by embracing your citizenship, you have, in a sense, you've given your oath. This is your country. So there is the reality here, somewhere, somehow, there's an oath going on, and God looks at it and goes, I take that seriously. Well, wisdom makes one unquestionably attractive by honoring oaths and obeying commands. Take it out of the government realm for a second. Let's take it to a different realm. Take it to the work realm. All right? As an employee, you may disagree with your boss. As a child, you may disagree with your parent, right? But think about an employee for a moment. You made an oath. You signed a contract to do something for return of pay. Well, think about that promise you made. While that disagreement is being communicated and considered, wisdom says our first instinct should be obedience. Just let that sit for a moment. This really runs counter to our human flesh. If I don't agree, I don't have to do it, and we'll talk about it. This seems to go the other way and say, look, you may not agree, but you need to start off with a foot that says, I'll obey, but I'd like to talk about it. Obviously, again, wisdom discerning if that command is a morally right command doesn't clash with God's. Wisdom says, here's what's attractive. When one says, all right, I'd like to have a conversation. I think this is seen in Joseph's life. In Genesis, here's a young man sold into slavery by his brothers, purchased by a pagan military leader. Joseph, he could have ranted and raged all around that house. Can't believe it. Kicking things, punching walls. I mean, he could have. Some of us probably would have responded that way. Grouching, grumbling. But instead, what Joseph does is he jumps full on into the work before him, so much so, as he works for his master, God grants him favor in the master's eyes, and Joseph's skillful obedience catches the master's eye. It's attractive. And we'll see later on a little bit more about that. Obey the authority. Secondly, slow the response. There's a process to this. Slow the response. The first half of verse 3 highlights this wise action. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Notice the verse doesn't say never leave. It just says don't rush. Don't rush. Slow down before walking out. Maybe we could put it in this way. How attractive is it to watch a fellow employee storm into the boss's office, rant and rave in heated argument, and then just walk out? If we're going to be honest, everyone sits there and goes, awkward. Everyone's kind of like, I don't really want to talk to them for a bit. That's not attractive. Just on a very human level. If you've been a boss or supervisor, had that experience, or maybe you've been a parent with a child or a teacher with a student, you know you didn't leave that conversation thinking things like this. Wow, they handled that so well. That was really wise. No. Perhaps there's more you should hear. An explanation or even an apology. Maybe you left too soon. maybe you'd miss that if you left, you'd miss that if you left too quickly, or maybe there would be a change of mind. You wouldn't want to leave too quickly on that, would you? And James seems to touch on this when he offers this advice in James 1:19. My dear brothers and sisters, understand this: everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Slow the response. And then thirdly, consider the cause. Verse 3 counsels us to not take our stand in an evil cause. Consider the cause you're taking up. Interestingly, that word translated evil there doesn't necessarily have to mean sinful. In other words, what Solomon's saying here doesn't necessarily mean consider that morally wrong cause you're picking up. I think CSB captures it well, says, think about the bad cause. It really, just in essence, in the context, it seems to be the cause opposed to the one who's an authority. Think about that before you just take up a cause. Consider the cause. Consider the nature of your cause in relation to the authority. The reason to pause and consider, we note here, is because the authority will end up doing whatever he or she wants. So let me give a little perspective on this illustration-wise. I think the force of this consideration and its reason is the idea that we should pick our battles carefully. Don't die on every hill. The authority will ultimately do whatever he or she decides, and you will destroy any reputation, any chance you might have of being able to talk with them if you fight everything they do. Consider the bad cause. That's not wise. Just again, putting this in other contexts, employees can do this with bosses. Church members can do this with pastors. Children can do this with parents. We can pick up things, and certainly at times authorities, it seems like they're just consistently failing to make right choices, and that can happen, right? This is broken authority. But the reality here is this: there's no faster way to shut the ear of such an authority than by persisting in a bad cause, picking away at every decision made. All of this comes together in verses 3 through 4 this way. The king does whatever he pleases, for the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, "What are you doing?" Really interesting connection here. That statement, "Who may say to him, what are you doing?" There's actually an echo of that in Daniel chapter 4. After Nebuchadnezzar is humbled by God, he's at the end of this, he comes out of the humility, and he's exalting God as sovereign over all, and he says this about God: there is no one who can block his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" In other words, God is the one who ordains human authority, and just as with God, so with humanity. There's a place for each to occupy. Wisdom remembers its place before authority. Daniel illustrates this so well in his early days of life in Babylon. He and his 3 friends refused to eat and drink the king's food and wine. When questioned about their conviction, Daniel wisely addresses his authority. He offers a compromise and says, "Look, give us 10 days to try this, and at the end of it all, you can deal with this as you see best." He kind of leaves it open-ended. Blank check, whatever you think best at that point, but just, would you give us 10 days? The entire account just rises with this perfume of wisdom. This young man knows how to wisely handle himself and interact with his authority, and it's attractive. So much so that when we went through Daniel a couple of years ago, we worked through chapter 1, and it really rose as this really exemplary way of how we interact. Because wisdom makes individuals unquestionably attractive. Second thing here in this passage. The first is that wisdom remembers its place before authority. Secondly, wisdom follows a process appealing to authority. Verses 5 through 6 start with a general principle. Obedience leads to safety. All right? That doesn't mean, though, that one never questions or appeals to authority. Here's where we could, again, this is human tendency. All right, obey authority. All right, obedience gives security, gives safety. So I guess I'll just always obey. Never question, never do anything else. So sometimes I almost hear Solomon sighing. Like, come on, guys. You know better than this. And it's like he's sighing at my heart because my heart does this. I'm like, oh yes, okay, then we'll just obey. And he's like, Kyle, come on. And that's where he goes. Yes, obedience brings safety, but then this, the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way, for there is a time and a way for everything. Wisdom doesn't demand absolute obedience without any questions. Again, obey, slow, consider, right? And obedience tends to bring safety, tends to bring security when you're dealing with authority, all right? But there's a proper time, there's a proper way. Instead, wisdom starts with obedience while waiting for the proper time and the just way of addressing the matter. And wisdom does this even though life is difficult in the meantime, at least according to the end of verse 6. This whole idea of even when pressures and troubles are building up, those are the times where we feel like, I got to do something right now. Two quick illustrations of how this plays out, I think, one in Scripture, one in history. I'll start with the one from history because it just popped into my mind this morning as Eric was talking to Sunday school. And he was talking about Justin Martyr and Justin Martyr's writings called his Apology. And if you were here, you know this, but for those who were not here, Justin Martyr basically is responding to the Roman ruler at the time because Rome is persecuting Christians. And so what Justin does is he lays out in multi-written form, as was explained this morning, the culture of Christianity. Here's what we do. Here's who we are. And we're not doing anything that you're accusing us of. And as he was sharing that this morning, I thought there's that proper time, proper way. John Calvin does this with the French government later on. There's a proper time and a proper way. Biblically speaking, I thought of the person Queen Esther in the Old Testament. What a picture of this. Wisdom understands and follows a process. You have this woman, her people, the Jews, are in exile, and she hears of a plot to murder them all, to exterminate. It's the final solution before there was a final solution. Talk about pressure. Talk about the end of verse 6, when troubles multiply and build up on your life. I think I'd be running into the king's room and being like, King, I got to talk to you right now. We got to have a conversation. If she was in our day, she would have done what every woman should do and stormed in and talked to her husband because he's incompetent. Who in the world would ever authorize such a thing? She follows the process of her day. She goes to her husband, the king, and she approaches him as he's supposed to be approached. It's odd to us. She has to actually go in, and she's in fear of death because if he doesn't hold out the scepter, she could die. Such an odd thing. But she follows the process, and then she proceeds to offer a banquet, and then she hosts a second banquet. And at the first banquet, if you're reading the story, you're kind of going, all right, Esther, the king's just said whatever you want. Here you go, right now. And she goes, come back for a second dinner. What? Come on, right now. In wisdom, she's following a process of appealing to her authority. How appealing, how attractive is this? Folks, it stands out. It's recorded in our scriptures. Wisdom follows a process appealing to authority. It's a little like a poem that we learned with our kids as they were growing up, and we now and then repeat it because they don't just need to hear it, we need to hear it as adults. And it goes like this. It's picking up on a little alphabet poem. E learns to entreat without complaining, asks helpful questions while always obeying. Entreaty is a good thing. Without complaining, asking helpful questions, remember that? Obey the authority while always obeying. There's wisdom, and it's attractive. The third thing in our passage, verses 7 through 9, wisdom provides perspective in dealing with authority. Some perspective here. Very quickly, I personally think the he that starts off in verse 4 connects us back to the king. It seems a bit odd to try and force that to connect back to the immediate in verse 7. connects back to the king in verse 4. It seems a bit odd to try and connect that back to the individual in verse 6. And I think as we play this out, this hopefully makes a little more sense. Verses 7 through 9, let me read them again for us so we see them here. Verse 7, "For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that's done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt." In other words, verses 7 through 8, I believe, specifically provide perspective on the authority who, at least for the moment, gets to do whatever he or she pleases. That's what Solomon's just described. Someone who says, this is the word, and that's final. Their word is supreme. That's how it's worded. That's hard. You know what? I can do all the other things. I can obey the authority. I can go the right way and consider my cause. I can appeal the right way. And I'm still stuck with this individual who maybe is not using their authority well. And boy, I need some help with my perspective. And it seems like what Solomon's getting at here is putting all of that individual's authority into perspective. Keep this bit of wisdom in mind. That authority is as limited as you and I in knowledge. Boy, that's a good reminder. Because when they speak, boom, that's supreme. When they get to do whatever they please, it seems like, boy, am I missing something? Am I just ignorant? You know what? They don't have any more knowledge than you or I in so many ways. He or she may act boldly, but they don't know, here's the thing, they don't know the future better than anyone else. Maybe that's even a caution as we obey. Just consider. No one can guess what's to be had in the future. I really like how the CSB translates verse 8. As strong and powerful as the authority may be, listen to this, no one has authority over the wind to restrain it. I think that's better than spirit here, based on context of Ecclesiastes. He keeps talking about the wind. Seems like that's a really good picture. No one has authority over the wind to restrain it. There's no authority over the day of death. Do you have authority over the day of your death? You get to decide when you're going to die. You get to decide all these things. No one has that authority. No one is discharged during battle, and wickedness will not allow those who practice it to escape. That last part of verse 8 seems to provide a perspective that just as one is not going to be released from military service in the middle of a battle, right? You're in the middle of a war, and the general's not going to come and be like, all right, discharge papers, here you go for half the military. You earned it. If you're in the middle of a war, you stay in the battle. Just like that, the person who's been giving themselves, practicing wickedness, all right, keep this in mind, an authority you look at and you're like, but they're not making right choices. They're persisting in wickedness. Well, here's the reminder, the perspective. A person who does that is not going to escape. Any more than a person fighting in the middle of a battle is going to get discharged and let go of the war. These are helpful perspectives to keep in mind. Does it solve everything right now? No. Does it make it all right? No. But that's what wisdom does. Wisdom helps us maneuver with skill God's way through God's world. In a time when one person has authority over another to his or her harm, wisdom provides good perspective about every earthly authority. Their knowledge is limited, as is their power, and those who practice wickedness, although seemingly successful for a time, will not escape their own destruction. I need those perspectives. I don't know about you, but I need those. And it's wisdom that comes along and says, now you've got to remember, Kyle, when you've done all there can be to do. When an individual persists in this wise perspective, it makes one unquestionably attractive. I hope the lab has shown us unequivocally the lesson of verse 1 to be true. Wisdom makes one unquestionably attractive. But I want to close by circling back to a question I raised near the beginning, and that is, what's the point? Are we simply looking at this and going, yay, so I can now be a little bit nicer, a little bit better to everyone around me in the world. That's a nice thing. Everyone likes that and makes me feel better. That's not the point here. I would argue scripturally, if you go to broader scripture, which I'm going to do in just a moment, that is not the point. And let me give you that, first of all, by just walking us through three individuals that we touched on, and then I want to take us to a passage to close. I use three individuals as illustrations: Joseph, Daniel, and Esther. What was the point of their attractive wisdom? Well, let the Bible talk. Genesis 39, verse 3 says this about Joseph: his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph made a name for himself? So Joseph was a little bit better of a guy? No. What happened was Potiphar, a pagan Egyptian, saw God. Or this testimony from Daniel to the powerful king of Babylon. He's getting ready to give the interpretation, and he says this: Nebuchadnezzar, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. I'm going to say what all the other wise men said, can't be done. But my neck, I like my neck. There's a God in heaven who reveals all mysteries. What a testimony. And the wisdom Daniel displays, is it so that he has a great name, so that he gets to be that really powerful guy in Babylon? No. All throughout Daniel, you realize it's that God is seen and glorified and magnified. And even though we don't hear God's name mentioned in Esther's story, the fingerprints of his wisdom and providence are evident all throughout the book. And here's the point. Believers live wisely in this world, especially in relation to God's ordained authorities, to show his glory and highlight his infinite wisdom. So, the wise way you interact with your boss this week tells those around you something about the God you profess to know and love. Parents, the way we wisely submit to and speak to our own authorities teaches our children about the God we want them to know. The way we, as members of this church, wisely obey those who have the rule over us and watch for our souls highlights God's wisdom. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter deals with this whole idea of authority in our relationships. I won't read through the passages, but you can look. Chapter 2, he talks about our relationship to governing authorities. He talks to slaves about their relationship to their masters, and he says this, not just to the good and the nice, but also to those who are evil, to those who have power over another to their hurt. And he gives instruction, and some of that instruction follows right what we've seen this morning, obey and all that. But previous to that, in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, he says this. Right before he gets into that, he says this: you are to conduct yourselves in an honorable way, so that those who are looking on, so the Gentiles would see you and they would glorify God. That's the point. Wisdom makes one unquestionably attractive. Don't throw wisdom out. Yes, it's going to teach you about the depravity of humanity. Yes, you're going to learn some hard things. Yes, it won't solve it all. Yes, it doesn't guarantee success. Yes, yes, yes. But don't throw it away. It's valuable. It will make you unquestionably attractive, not for you, but for the God who made you and stamped his image on your life. And so pursue wisdom. Get wisdom. And with all you're getting, get understanding. Let's pray.